Welcome. We're glad you're here. Thank you for joining us for this program tonight. Fairport's mission is inspiring families, and our goal tonight is to inspire you to optimize wealth at every stage. Got a little quote for you. In this world, nothing can be said to be certain except death and taxes. It sounds very serious, very depressing. Don't worry, Pete and I make taxes fun, so you will enjoy yourselves tonight. So I've talked to a lot of clients this summer, and I will say the one common theme in everything we've discussed is the means to the end is not the money. The means to the end is getting to your goals, and it's the money that gets you there. So whether it's remodeling that 1990s bathroom, buying your favorite sports car, whatever you're trying to accomplish, we're hoping to share some tips with you at these varying stages of the cycle to get you to where your goals might be. Now I understand, we're going to talk about early savings years, peak earnings years. I'm well beyond early savings years, I can tell you that, and I'm sure some of you in this room are. But keep in mind, we're trying to inspire not just you, but your families, your friends. So hopefully you'll get some tidbits to share with folks that you're friends with and with your families.
Thank you, Emily. This is a great chart here. It demonstrates the power of compounding, which has often been termed the eighth wonder of the world. And what it does is it compares two saving strategies and to see who's accumulate more at retirement. So investor one starts at age 25 and contributes $5,000 a year for 10 straight years. Whereas investor two starts at age 35 and contributes $5,000 a year, but for 30 years. So this assumes a hypothetical 8% return. Investor one actually accumulates $175,000 more than investor two at age 65 in retirement, despite contributing $100,000 less. And it's all due to starting early and letting your money grow for you. So another way to relate the power of compounding is the rule of 72. Has anybody ever heard of the rule of 72? Okay, a lot of people here. So for those of you who haven't, this is an easy takeaway to remember. You start with 72 and you divide it by a stated interest rate, and that determines how long money will double. So at 6%, money doubles every 12 years, 72 divided by 6. At 8%, 9 years. If you accumulated $500,000 at age 45 and it grew at 6%, it would double to $1 million at age 57 and $2 million at age 69. And this is all through the power of compounding. My only thing I would say about this slide is that we need to do a better job convincing the millennial generation of this strategy.
Is that a kid reference, Pete? No, you've got Z's like me. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about retirement plans, starting off with company retirement plans, and I just want to talk about some big overarching themes and strategies. First of all, if you're talking to kids and grandkids and they're just starting out, they're probably not at the point where they can max out like a lot of us in this room can. So the goal really is to contribute at least enough to get your company a match and to have a real strategy around when I get a raise, I'm going to push as much of that raise as possible into my retirement plans so that I can inch my way up to that max. I think the other thing I'll say that probably resonate with some of us that are in the later stages is don't sleep on the fact that just because you're contributing to a company 401k or a 403b from an institution you work at, for example, it doesn't mean that you can't also contribute to a self-employed plan. I don't know if any of you have or are familiar with SEP IRAs, solo 401ks. If you have separate self-employment income and earned employee income, you can be contributing to both plans and really put some oomph into your retirement savings. A couple of other things I want to talk about because I get a ton of questions about them. I get the to Roth or not to Roth. Should I do a Roth conversion? Should I contribute to a Roth? And for anybody who's in lower tax brackets, it's obviously a slam dunk that if you're contributing to a 401k that has a Roth component to it, contribute to the Roth. But a lot of us aren't. A lot of us are in higher brackets. I would say this much. You want to set yourself up for choices throughout all of retirement. So there have even been plenty of instances where we have suggested to clients to, for example, do Roth conversions when they're in the higher brackets. I'll give you a quick story. Someone that we worked with, it was about 15 years ago, had a very significant IRA. We actually did about $1 million of a Roth conversion way back when. It has now grown to about $4 million. So he's got tax-free savings of $3 million. This is a much more efficient asset for him to pass along to his next generation. So it was an exceedingly good decision. And I'll say thank you to Tom Seifert, because he was a big part of that decision when we recommended that to clients. So don't think that just because you're in a higher bracket that Roth conversions don't make sense. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Couple of other things just to be mindful of. There are two things that I'll raise, one of which I rarely see, if ever, and I'm curious if anyone's seen it in this room, the super catch-up. The super catch-up came about in one of the more recent Secure Acts, and it's a very small window of people ages 60 to 63, can actually inject their catch-up contribution. This year it's as high as $11,250. So you can do this, but, the big but, your employer plan actually has to allow for it. I haven't come across one yet that allows for it. And you have to catch yourself in that window, 60, 61, 62, or 63. So I've not actually even officially used it. Anyone here, a raise of hands, heard of it, used it? Okay, 2 advisors in the room have. So, okay, don't forget about that. That's a little ditty for you. And then the other thing I'll mention is mega Roth contributions. There are actually some local institutions that help in making that very manageable. Not all companies allow for mega Roth contributions. The long and short of it is your plan has to allow for both in-service distributions and after-tax contributions. So that's something that if you're trying to inject a lot more money into your plan, it allows you to do after-tax contributions and then convert it to a Roth within the plan using the in-service distribution rule. So keep that one in mind. Just quickly on IRAs, this shares with you the limits. I'm not going to read them at you, and we've talked a bit about Roths and whether to convert. Oh, this is where the kid stories come in.
So just one follow-up on what Emily said is very important. Just because the IRS allows you to do something, it needs your company plan in order to allow that for you. So there is a distinction between the two. Okay, so when we first did this seminar over 6 years ago, my oldest son was just starting college. And now, 6+ years later, he is still in college. But knock on wood, he is supposed to be graduating next month. He just needs to get by Spanish 3, and I'll believe it when I see it. But he's come a long way. You know, in the beginning, he would regularly call his college savings plan a 592 plan. And now he regularly calls to see if there's still a balance in it. So 529.2 plans have a lot of built-in tax advantages. The earnings grow tax-free, distributions are tax-free, as long as they're used for what's called qualified education expenses, includes tuition, room and board, books, technology. Contributions to a 529 plan are deemed taxable gifts, but if you stay under the annual exclusion, which is $19,000 this year, there are no gift tax consequences. And furthermore, you can front load a 529 plan of 5 years contributions of that annual exclusion into 1 year. The only caveat is you can't make any gifts to the beneficiary over the next 5-year window. If you're a resident of Ohio and you invest in Ohio's plan, you get a deduction up to $4,000 per beneficiary, and any excess can be carried over. One of the new changes to 529 plans this year as part of the One Big Beautiful Bill is it allows an increase from $10,000 to $20,000 annually to be taken out and used for private school tuition and books of that nature for ages K through 12. Last year, there was also a new provision to 529 plans for excess funds. So you could now roll over to a Roth IRA, penalty and tax-free, over a 5-year period, up to a $35,000 lifetime limit for a beneficiary whose plan has been opened at least 15 years. Now you still have to stay under the guise of the $7,000 Roth IRA contribution limits, which means the beneficiary has to at least have that much in earned income in order for you to be able to do this strategy. But this is a very nice option for a lot of those overfunded plans that you may have for children and grandchildren out there. And this also leads me to family dynamic number 2. My middle son graduated college last year, and he's off the payroll and now in the workforce. Although I don't know if I can say he's really off the payroll when he lives at home rent-free and his mother still cooks for him. But nevertheless, he has accumulated some excess funds in his plan. And I also find that amazing how when you graduate in 4 years, that can happen. But he does not feel that his brother should have benefit of his plan balances. And which is another key feature of 529 plans. It allows the owner the ability to transfer funds to any other family member's 529 plan. So if you have kids that one needs it more than the other, or one doesn't go to college, you can transfer them very easily between it. But I just find it ironic how beneficiaries have a different take of fairness than the owner, i.e. me, when the owner contributes everything.
How long can you contribute to a 529 plan?
There's no end limit. There's a maximum.
Do you still put money in your kids' 529?
Mm-hmm. There's nothing to prohibit it, and Emily, correct me if I'm wrong, that if your kids have all been through college and there's a balance to let it grow, tax deferred. There's no certain year period that it can only stay in there so long. So in essence, it could go to the next generation grant. You just have to use it for education, or there is tax complications and penalties.
Yeah, Pete, I'm on the same page with you on that one. All right, I love this topic. I love talking about HSAs. HSAs are one of the few what they call triple tax protected vehicles. And so, in other words, you can contribute pre-tax, it grows tax-free, you take the money out after tax. Who doesn't want that? Now, the challenge is you have to have they call them high deductible plans, and that it's kind of a misnomer. It doesn't mean because your deductible isn't high enough, you aren't eligible. You really should just ask HR, is this an HSA eligible plan? But the beauty of these things is you can save, get a tax deduction, let it grow tax-free. And really, what I generally recommend, if you can do it, and I am doing this in some years more painfully than others, you can save the money and leave it alone. Don't use it for medical expenses right now. Arguably, at my age, hopefully I don't have as many medical expenses, and I'm gonna try to get that thing to grow for as long as I possibly can. And as my medical expenses ramp up in my later years, I can draw this money after it's grown tax-free for a really long time. Couple of things, and I'm learning this as we go. Found out recently that a lot of, and I won't name certain companies, but a lot of plans nickel and dime you, particularly post-retirement. The last thing you want is erosion of your HSA. You don't want lots of little fees here and there and everywhere. The best two plans I've found for lots of investment flexibility and very low administrative fees are Fidelity and the plan called Lively, which is on the Schwab chassis. These are great plans. They don't nickel and dime you. Another interesting fact I learned just in the last week, as a matter of fact, is they don't all pay attention to the limitations. We had a client who turned 65. I swear at the meeting, because it said on the agenda, said, stop making contributions. He didn't. They let him keep making contributions. So we had to do a corrective distribution here just this week. So keep your eye on things like that. But up until you turn age 65, if you have a high deductible plan, you can contribute and build that tax-free bucket. And tax-free money in retirement is golden. It's what you want. I'll compare and contrast that with an FSA. Yeah.
I thought that was if you were just on Medicare, you turn 65 and still have an insurance plan that's high deductible, you didn't contribute.
Most people generally do go on some piece of Medicare at 65 unless they're still working. But yes, there are some caveats there. Yeah.
And another point, though, is what I found. If you don't use the HSA like Emily's doing, and say, save your receipts, because
great point, Tom.
you can keep your receipts as long as they're for medical, and then you can spring it on. If you want to buy a new car, here's $60,000 of past medical expenses, and you can pull the money out.
And that's another point, too. You can reimburse yourself for your Medicare premiums once you're at 65, even if you're not contributing. The nice thing about the HSA is it does not have to happen in the same calendar year.
Yeah.
Like with a 529 plan, the expenses have to be reimbursed in the same year. With an HSA plan, it can be well after the year you incurred the medical expense.
This is why I have a stack of medical bills, including my son's ACL tear, a mile high, because eventually I'm going to get myself some reimbursements. I will compare it with an FSA. They are different. FSAs are use it or lose it. As you've heard here, HSAs are not. You can't have both and use them in tandem unless you have what's called a limited purpose FSA. And most companies that offer HSAs know that. So those are really the big contrasts, that and the fact that you can fund the HSA more heavy. Limits this year, for example, for an HSA, family is $8,550, and there's a catch-up for 55 and over of $1,000, and then individuals $4,300. So we have a whole program about this. It's called Pay Perks and Parachutes, where we talk about negotiating your compensation during your peak earning years. There's no way I could cover everything, all these buckets, but I'll just give you a couple highlights. It's all a matter of leverage. The time when you have the most leverage to negotiate your compensation is generally when they want you the most, when they're working the hardest to get you. So we always suggest to people, negotiate your way out on the way in. We've had people try to negotiate their way out on the way out. Doesn't work. There is no leverage left. Do not underestimate the power of non-cash compensation, particularly when you're living in the world of salary bands and bonus caps and things like that. A way that you can increase your compensation where companies are often amenable is have them agree to reimburse more of your expenses. Hey, that club that you happen to belong to, that, I'm a CPA and my AI CPA dues are quite expensive. Making sure that you're negotiating in some of those things, that can actually get you a nice sizable increase in comp. Or if you walk away from a job that's doing that and into one that's not, you're going to be real ticked off at yourself after a couple of months when you realize that you're not benefiting quite as much. And then I'll just share one more thing. I feel like a lot of people have a hard time negotiating for themselves. And I'll say, hopefully I won't sound sexist, but particularly I find with women, we have a hard time advocating for ourselves. And I'll share a story. We had a now retired corporate executive, CFO. She knows her stuff. She was offered a position and was walking away from a restricted grant that was vesting in 6 months. Her new company offered her a cliff vesting restricted grant that was going to vest in 4 years. And I just said to her, I'm like, hey, you got to ask the question. Because what if you and your boss don't get along and you're not there in 4 years? Oh, I don't know if they're going to acquiesce to this. So I asked the question. And she did. And they made a change. And her boss actually didn't like her anymore after 2 years. And so it was around $750,000 that she would have lost out on. So she and I get along really well. She's forever grateful. So that's it on that slide. And now we're going to talk about tax nitty-gritty. It's time for Pete's tax stuff.
So obviously, taxes have gotten a lot of attention lately and was really the cornerstone of the one big beautiful bill of legislation that was signed this month. It's hard to believe it's still the same month. But the chart here that you're looking at, this is a 100-year history of tax rates. And if you look at the top line, that is ordinary rates. And that usually includes things like your wages, your self-employment income, Social Security, IRA distributions. The bottom line is the capital gain rate. That would include dividends, investment sales of that nature. So if you look all the way to the right here, and it really hasn't changed, we are still in historic low rate environment with both ordinary income and capital gains. I think one of the questions on the quizzes was probably back here where it was 77% when you look at the top rate. So we've come a long way. Now this slide is an extension of the previous slide, but it looks at the last 25 years of the changes in tax rates. And if you look at the post-2018 far right-hand column, this is what was made permanent by the One Big Beautiful Bill. So ordinary income is divided into 7 brackets, and it ranges from 10 to 37%. Capital gain and dividends I should say qualified dividends, have 3 tax brackets of 0, 15, and 20. Now, just to complicate things here, because the math doesn't work, you have to take into consideration the Affordable Care or Health Care surtaxes, which apply to individuals who earn over $200,000 and joint filers over $250,000. And it is 0.9% on earned income, and it is 3.8% on dividends and capital gains. So when you look at this far column, the top rate is 37.9% for ordinary income and 23.8% for capital gains. Okay, so knowing how President Trump has an affinity for overusing superlatives, is anybody really surprised that this would be called the One Big Beautiful Bill? And we're not going to go through all this because this is a 900-page bill. And we're really just kind of focus on some of the changes that became permanent and some of the new provisions that affect individual income taxes. So please stop us if you have questions or you want to address something that really isn't on this slide. But we tried to hit on the main ones. And the main provision of this bill was it made permanent a lot of the changes of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017. So it seems like a lot happened, but it really was just an extension. Because had we not had new tax legislation this year, the rules from the 2017 law would have expired at the end of December of this year. And a couple notable things on the permanent side, ordinary rates have dropped on average of 3% prior to the 17 law, and the standard deduction has now become permanent. So for 2025, it's $15,750 for individuals and $31,500 for joint filers. Now, nearly 90% of all taxpayers now take the standard deduction, and this compares to less than 70% under the old rules. The other permanent change is AMT, which stands for Alternative Minimum Tax. It was retained, but substantially increased to a sigh of relief to everybody. I used to always say if you ask 10 CPAs to explain AMT, you'd get 11 different answers. Nobody could properly explain it, and it affected 80% of the people making between $250,000 and $500,000. In fact, it used to ensnare 5 million people in it, and now it's down to under 200,000. And again, had these tax laws not been extended or changed, it was projected to probably bring 7 million people back into AMT. All right, let's talk about some of the new provisions in the bill, which probably you want to hear about. The state, local, and real estate tax, that's the affectionately known as SALT, that you've probably heard a lot in the news and has got a lot of attention. So starting in 2025, these all have different years, but starting this year, the cap has now been increased from $10,000 to $40,000. Now, the amount is subject to a limitation. So the deduction starts to phase out for both single filers and joint filers at $500,000. And the definition I think we're seeing is going to be, they're calling it adjusted gross income, but it could be modified adjusted gross income, which does bring tax-exempt interest back in the equation. So they haven't written everything yet. They get 90 days post-legislation to write in committee. So we will not get true guidance probably till the fall, which is a blessing that this actually happened in the summer, because had this all been jammed through at the end of the year and tax returns starting to file, it would have been a nightmare filing season for everybody. The other thing to consider is that this is a temporary deduction. So after 2029, the cap goes back to $10,000 if new legislation is not enacted. Now there's phase outs on all this. For this one, I think this one goes to $600,000 and it's a 30% phase out to there. So what does that mean? That means if you earn under $500,000 and you have $40,000 in deduction, you should be able to take it. If you earn over $600,000, you're probably going to be limited to that $10,000. And if you're in somewhere between $500,000 and $600,000, you could be anywhere from $10,000 to $40,000 based on what that amount is. The next one is the no tax on Social Security. Now this one's, there was a lot of confusion on it because there was different provisions in the House and Senate bill. And the way it had to shake out, because Social Security does not fall under the purvey of budget reconciliation rules. And since Congress is so dysfunctional, that is the only way they can pass laws these days is through budget reconciliation. So the workaround was they are giving seniors age 65 and older an additional $6,000 standard deduction. And that does start for this year as well, but it does expire at 2028. Are you seeing a trend here? Everything is either going to be temporary or have an AG phase out because of the cost of this bill. Now, the phase out for this one is much lower. It is $75,000 for individuals and $150,000 for joint filers. And I think that range is probably $100,000 before you're completely phased out. Okay, the other two things which may not affect anybody in this room, but that got a lot of attention is workers can now deduct $25,000 of their tip income. What's interesting is these two provisions for overtime and tip income are going to come off your tax return. You're still going to be subject to payroll taxes, FICA, and so forth. You're just going to get a deduction off your tax return when you file. So the AGI limits for both of these are the same. It's $150,000 for single filers and $300,000 for joint. Now, the wages and tip income, the $25,000 for tips and the $12,500 for overtime, it does apply to each individual, but if you're filing separate, or not separately, but individually or jointly, those would be the caps. And again, these are good for 2025 and expire after 2028. Also, there is a new $10,000 deduction for auto loan interest. And this is for new cars, not leased, new cars only, purchased between 2025 and 2028. And it has to have final assembly in the US, which I'm sure dealers will gladly tell you that when you go to look for a new car. But the phase out on this one's a little different as well. It's $100,000 for single filers and it's $200,000 for joint filers. But this is also one that you do not have to itemize and to be able to get this deduction. So it is on top of whether you take the standard deduction or itemize. And the last one on the bottom there, this is new. This is a new permanent above-the-line charitable deduction. Okay, it's $1,000 for single and $2,000 for joint. This does not go into effect until next year, but it is permanent. There's no AGI phase out and there's no expiration. And this one also, you do not need to itemize to be able to take this. This is similar to back in the COVID years when they allowed that $300 and $600 above the line charitable deduction. They put a little more teeth into it for here. So this is a brief summary. You know, if you have questions on other things you've heard or you want us to address anything, we're happy to do so. But we felt these were the highlights that probably affected most of the people in this room.
Yeah, just following up on charitables, I think they're, you know, so you itemize or you don't itemize, and a lot of people still won't itemize because of this large standard deduction. So there will be a benefit if you are charitably inclined to get $2,000 above the line, as Pete suggested. But if you do itemize, I think there is a new threshold for charitables.
Yeah, so that's a good point. So there's a 0.5% floor. So it's all going to be based on what your adjusted gross income is. So you have to get over this 0.5% floor, and anything above that is the full benefit. Think of it like the medical expenses. This is 7.5% floor. Obviously, that's a much higher one to get over. So there is a 0.5% floor to get over to be able to take that deduction.
So, Pete, I don't know if you're going to get into this, but there is going to be some strategies around bunching your deductions, your state and local taxes, try to get them in all 1 year to try to itemize,
Yeah.
over the thresholds, and then the following year, you're going to take a standard deduction. So.
We used to always have a slide for that, actually, bunching, because one of the things about the 2017 Tax Act, it took away a lot of deductions, when you really think about it, and charitable is the one that really remains. So to Tom's point, what a lot of people did when this law first came out is they would bunch their deductions. So one of the things, and Emily and I will talk about this a little later when we get into charitable gifting, is we have a lot of clients, and I'm sure in this room, that have donor-advised funds. So you could make a big slug of a contribution into your donor-advised fund, and then you could gift out from that fund the same amount of charity maybe over 3 years. But you'd make the contribution in year 1, take the standard deduction in the next 2 years, and then maybe replenish it. This way, it's easier to get above those thresholds. I think what's making it difficult as tax planners and for our clients is those hurdles and thresholds are getting much higher to be able to itemize. So unless you're really giving substantial charitable amounts, it does make it a more difficult, and you really have to look at each year by year to determine, hey, does this make sense in a year to do itemized deductions, or should we just take the standard deduction? I met with a client just last week, and their donor advised fund was getting kind of low, but he was having a really good income year. So we said, well, maybe we wait till next year, because he's this commission driven and he wasn't going to have as big of a year. And I said, you might be able to sneak into this $500,000 limit. They pay a lot in real estate taxes, so we maybe will get more bang for our buck. And then we can couple that with a donor advised contribution. So I think that's the planning, or the takeaway that you should be thinking about is bunching is going to be with charitable deductions plus this potential cap that you have through 2029. So there is going to be more opportunity in the coming years that we've had in the last 7.
Yeah, and one easy one to bunch would be real estate taxes. I mean, you can play the whole bill in December and do it in January, so you got 2 years worth of real estate taxes in one to get you, close to that $40,000.
Yeah, because this law does go into effect this year, we haven't really had to deal with this a lot at year end. Now, most of Cuyahoga County residents, the bill usually comes out the last week in December, but you can go online and get it before that. And I know a lot of the other counties, the outlying counties, have February as due dates. However, you can always pay prior to year end on account for that. And this, to Tom's point, this is the year that if you think your income is going to be under these caps and you can get a lot higher than $10,000 on it, you might as well take it, because the other beauty of this, AMT is probably not going to be a problem. Before, we would have clients prepay before year end, and we wouldn't know whether or not we got full benefit because AMT usually knocks some of that benefit out. If you're not anywhere close to AMT, which again, most people really aren't, you could get full benefit, and you definitely want to make, if you can, make 3 years of real estate 6-month payments this year instead of 2. Okay, anything else on the one big beautiful bill? And we'll touch on other provisions of this as we go along as well.
So we talk a lot about diversification when we talk about investments, but there's something to be said, a lot to be said actually, about focusing on tax diversification. And I've hit on it a little bit as we've gone along, but there's a couple ways you can do this. I mean, first of all, in an ideal world, you think about your money in buckets, and in retirement, you've got representation of funds in all 3 buckets. You've got your tax-free assets, which don't get taxed. You've got your taxable capital gains assets, which will get taxed at maximum 20%. And then you've got your ordinary income assets, like your 401ks and your IRAs that are going to distribute. And when they do, you pay whatever your marginal income tax rate or your effective income tax rate is at the time. To give yourself the most choices in retirement, you want to try to balance out those buckets so that you can actually manage your tax brackets and more importantly, honestly, because it can be even more costly, you want to be able to manage your Medicare cost brackets, also fondly or not so fondly known as IRMA. We don't like IRMA. She can really raise your Medicare premium significantly. I think the base Medicare premium is $185, and she can push them up as high as over $600 because your adjusted gross income is too high. So if you are thoughtful in your early savings years, peak savings years, and quite honestly, one of the best times to do this is in your early retirement years. Try to get those buckets balanced out. Use Roth conversions. Fund that HSA so that when you are deeper in retirement and you're taking distributions, you have choices of where to pull your money from. You can manage those tax brackets. You can manage IRMA, that cranky person that costs you a lot of extra money. I think really the only other thing I'll highlight here is we always want to keep a focus on liquid versus illiquid investments. I don't have a lot of them, but I do have a very sad story about someone who pushed himself way too far into illiquidity and was wealthy on his balance sheet, but having a very hard time with cash flow. None of us ever want to get there. So I think particularly as you invest and as you look towards retirement, make sure you're balancing those liquid and illiquid investments and that you've got plenty of your liquid assets to fund your distributions and then some. And I kind of hit on this already as I was talking about the last slide. It's about those managing those buckets and managing your cash flow in retirement. I do a lot of Roth conversions. I think probably a lot of the advisors in this room do Roth conversions all the way up until RMDs kick in. Because if you think about it, if all you're doing, let's just say for argument's sake, you're in the 22% tax bracket. I just had a discussion with a client today in this situation. You're in the 22% tax bracket. You're in the second from the bottom IRMA bracket. If you've got wiggle room in there, use it. Because not only does it push money into a tax-free bucket, but it actually reduces your IRA so that your future RMDs are lower. And then finally, as mentioned way earlier in the conversation, you are creating a much more efficient asset to pass along to the next generation. Think about your kids, think about grandkids, nieces, nephews, whoever you're giving this money to. Is it better to inherit a traditional IRA where you have to take it out over 10 years as a non-spousal beneficiary and pay taxes on it, or a Roth IRA where, yeah, you still have to take it out over that period, but it's coming out to you tax-free? So there's a real estate planning component to some of this decision-making as well.
Okay, so the big news in the retirement world, Emily's kind of touched on this a bit, was the Secure Act 2.0. And what this did is, it did a lot of things, but the main thing what it did is it increased the required minimum distribution, or the RMD age that you'll hear us talk about, from 72 to 73, and then again to 75 for all those lucky birds born in 1960 or later. What RMDs are, they're annual taxable amounts that you must withdraw from retirement accounts, and it's based on an actuarial life expectancy factor that increases each year as you get a year older. Basically, the IRS doesn't want you to die with your money. They want to get a piece of it. But one of the big things that the Secure Act did is it had a big impact on inherited IRAs. So normally when a spouse dies, the surviving spouse can roll over that IRA to their own and stretch it out over their life, or take it out of their life expectancy as is. That did not change. What changed is what's called a non-spouse beneficiary, which is usually your children. They now have to deplete the account within 10 years. Now, why does that matter? Well, under the old rules, if you had a child age 40 and inherited an IRA, they could stretch that IRA out over a much longer period and pay much less in taxes every year. And now under the new rules, that balance has to be exhausted by the end of the 10th year for that beneficiary. The other thing the IRS did was they came out with final regulations last year that said if you are a non-spouse beneficiary and you have inherited an IRA, you have to take the RMD out if the account owner died after they started taking their own RMD. Basically, once an RMD starts, it can't be turned off. Now, what are some strategies that you kind of counter this? Well, we've talked about Roth IRAs, and it's very effective to kind of lessen the burden to your beneficiaries. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. You can convert as much or as little. And we play this rate game where if we can convert it and not bump you in too much of a higher tax bracket, that really can result in tax savings over a longer period, especially if rates go up in the future. The other strategy is what's called a qualified charitable distribution, and this comes off from an IRA. It's actually a very effective strategy, especially if you're charitably inclined and you don't need the income. Now, some of the requirements are you have to be at least 70 and a half, and the amount for this year, it does get indexed to inflation each year, cannot be more than $108,000. And I should add, no, children are not deemed charity, so it can't go there. But you might ask, okay, why not just take the charitable deduction like we talked about? And again, rule of thumb always is, if you can get an above the line deduction versus a below the line deduction, you don't have to get over these hurdles potentially. Plus, by donating your RMD, it lowers your adjusted gross income, which in turn could lower your Medicare premiums, what Emily just talked about. And if you're a resident of a state like Ohio that does not give you a deduction for charitable contributions, this could be another 3 or 4% savings to you. Now, I should add, the governor just came out with his budget last month, and they're proposing a 2.75% flat tax rate now for Ohio. So you'll still get a benefit, just maybe not quite as high.
I didn't know that, Pete. That's interesting. All right, we're not going to spend a ton of time on Social Security unless you want to. I've gotten a lot of questions about it lately. I feel like a lot of people are concerned. I've had people even call and ask, is it going to go away? Should I take it right now? I have my opinions. I'm sure other people in this room may have differing opinions, and I welcome those as well. I'm not telling people to rush to the doors and collect Social Security because I'm afraid it's going to poof by 2034. I don't think that's the case. I think they'll make some bigger, more systemic changes to, for example, the cap on Social Security tax that we pay in order to keep it viable. I think that would be the smart thing to do so that all the people on Social Security don't get mad at them. But I could end up wrong. I'll just highlight a couple things here. Full retirement age, it has gradually changed from age 65 to 67. You can start collecting benefits as early as age 62 or 60 if you're a widow. If you do, though, there can be substantial reductions that continue throughout the lifetime of your collection of Social Security. And if you're a high earning spouse, for example, and make one of these decisions to collect early, you can impact your spouse and their future ability to collect if they're collecting off of your record. So unless you really need the income, I generally find that the break even to wait until full retirement age, and again, unless you don't think you have longevity, the break even typically supports waiting at least until full retirement age. If you wait till age 70, and by the way, you don't want to wait until beyond, but if you wait until age 70, for every year that you wait, you get an automatic just 8% injection into your Social Security. So it's like essentially a guaranteed 8% increase. So there are a lot of people that decide to wait until age 70 if they think they have longevity, if they really don't need the cash flow. Sadly, there used to be all kinds of cool strategies where you could play the spousal benefit and collect and stop, and can't do that anymore. I did it a couple times a long time ago, and it felt really cool, and they have eliminated essentially most of those strategies. Benefits still up, just 85% of it is taxable regardless of your income, and no, there was no elimination of tax on Social Security. Pete, I think this one's yours.
All right, we're at the fourth and final stage here. Not only did the income tax change or become permanent. So did the estate tax world. The former 2017 law that I addressed earlier also made permanent the estate exemptions in the One Big Beautiful Bill. Now, going back to 2017, it had actually doubled the exemption, to show you how far we've come, from 5.5 million to roughly 11 million. And it indexed it to inflation. So in 2015, that became nearly $14 million. So everybody here has a $14 million exemption, which means if you're a joint couple, you would have to have more than $28 million in net assets in order to have an estate tax liability. Now, the new bill made permanent this exemption, and so starting in 2026, the amount increases to $15 million, and which would be $30 million for a joint couple. And this will also get indexed to inflation. The highest estate tax will remain at 40% for any of those taxable estates. Now, there are a couple other provisions that remain the same. They really didn't touch. The one that really is important, that got some discussion the last time this law came around, but really didn't get this time, is the step up in basis of assets at the decedent's death. And this is huge for beneficiaries because they can virtually inherit assets and sell them with no capital gains taxes. The other item is portability, which basically means the surviving spouse can utilize the unused exemption of the deceased spouse. It does make estate planning somewhat simpler, so you don't have to worry as much titling assets in each other's names to avoid wasting the unified credit. But one word of caution I would say is that even though a lot of these income tax and these estate tax laws have been made permanent, there is nothing to prevent a future Congress from enacting legislation and repealing all of this.
So talking a little bit about giving, leading up to that really large exemption, I think this is a way we've been able to make a really big impact, and in a more fun way. I mean, it's great to leave your kids and grandkids and nieces and nephews money when you pass away, but isn't it even more fun to be able to give money to the next gen and to actually be a part of them enjoying it, watch them enjoy it? So we do a lot of that. This year, the annual gift exclusion is $19,000 per person. And if you elect gift splitting, you can do up to double that, so up to $38,000. So if you think about it, you can really have a huge impact in both giving to your family, but also reducing your estate by just doing annual gifting. Another thing that we use a lot is intra-family loans. I'm thinking about a client right now whose grandson is going to medical school, and he doesn't really have the funds for it. And rather than take school loans, which have become wildly expensive, he is actually taking a loan from his grandmother's family trust. And as long as you extend a rate that is at least the applicable federal rate, AFR, it is truly considered a loan. You can forgive that loan. You have lots of flexibility. You want to document it. Again, you want to make sure you use the AFR, but it's a great way to benefit the next generation while you're still alive. The AFRs have varied. I think when I did this presentation in 2022, the AFRs were so low. They were in the 2% range. Short-term, mid-term, long-term were 237, 299, and 322. Last year when Pete and I did this presentation, the AFRs were wonky. Yeah. It was actually better to borrow on a long-term basis than on a short-term basis. That's evened itself out, and AFRs have come down. So back in 24, AFRs, when we did this presentation, were 495, 434, and 452. Now they're 396, 399, and 471 as of August. So essentially, this is a great way to help the next gen to use your assets and still actually not use up any of your exemption. Again, we could probably do an entire presentation on SLATs, GRADs, QPERTs, irrevocable life insurance trusts. I think because the exemption is so high, there are only some clients that would find this of interest and that would benefit from this. But if you, raise of hands, does anyone want to dig deeper into spousal trusts or GRATs? Because you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to say, Tom, take it away.
Or you could come ask us afterwards.
And I was going to
if you have
say,
any
yeah,
questions.
come visit with any of us afterwards and we can talk more in depth about those planning strategies. A little more complicated, but definitely useful in some situations.
I'm sure a lot of people in this room have a passion for certain charitable causes. And the good news is it can help minimize your taxes too. So gifting appreciated property or stock is a very effective gifting strategy that's often overlooked. Now there's some rules depending on how long you held it. If it's less than a year, you only get a deduction at the cost basis or what you paid for it. But if you hold it greater than a year, you get the full fair market value. There is the deduction is limited to 30% of your adjusted gross income. So for example, let's assume you make $100,000 and you want to give $40,000 of appreciated stock to a charity. You would only be able to deduct $30,000 in the current year, but that $10,000 would get carried over to be able to be utilized in the next 5 years. If a stock has lost value, it's actually better just to sell the stock and give the cash to the charity, because you still may be able to take a charitable deduction if you itemize, and you'll be able to take a loss on the sale. Now, appreciated stock or gifting is what we call a dual tax benefit. Not quite as great as the triple threat of HSA, but a very powerful dual threat. And what I mean by that is, assume you're an individual taxpayer and you're in the highest ordinary bracket, and you donate a $10,000 appreciated stock that you paid $5,000 for. So by donating versus selling, you're going to save, or you're going to get a $3,700 deduction. That's the $10,000 at 37%. Plus, you're going to save $1,000 on the 20% capital gain that you did not have to pay on that $5,000 gain within it. So in this simple little example, you've basically gotten almost as much back in tax savings, the $4,700, which would be the $3,700 plus the $1,000, versus what you paid for the stock, around $5,000. Now, this is really a win-win strategy for both you and the charity, because the charity can sell the stock immediately for cash and not have any tax consequences. So I would like to share a story of this very same strategy. So we have a relatively new client. He's single, early 80s, doesn't have any children or siblings, and his estate goes to charity. So he had historically been paying pretty significant estimated tax liabilities. So we showed him that we could reduce his tax liability pretty substantially by gifting appreciated stock. Plus, it would allow him to see some of the impact of his charitable giving. Now, knowing that nature, and more specifically the Cleveland Metro Parks, was very near and dear to him, we reached out to them to see if maybe we could do something unique based on certain levels of giving. Well, I found out they do not name trails after individuals, so don't ever go looking in the Metro Parks to see that. However, they do offer plaques and park benches, which piqued his interest for a legacy. So last month, I had the pleasure of joining him when his new park bench was installed in the Metro Parks. And being the humble person that he is, he did not want the bench named after him.
I know, I love that story.
Now, I don't know if you can see this, but he had it inscribed, "Nature, a gift to preserve." And even though this is a beautiful canopy under black walnut and pawpaw fruit trees, what you don't see is a spectacular view of the Rocky River that we're staring at. And it is on the Millstream Run reservation that is not far from his house that he walks every day.
And that's so cool.
So my takeaway to all of you is, not only can charitable giving gets you immediate tax benefits, but it also allows you to have some personal satisfaction while you're still alive.
I love that. I got to admit, teared me up. Donor advised funds. Pete hit on them a little bit earlier, so I won't spend a lot of time here, but it is a great way to save money and to do it in a strategic way and very focused way. Using an example, you may have big income years. You may be a corporate executive, you're retiring from a corporate board, and you have a lot of payouts all in one year. Or you're retiring from your job and you have a big payout at the end of the rainbow. Those are great years to front load money into a donor advised fund, ideally highly appreciated stocks, so you get that double threat benefit. And at the end of the day, once you've put that money into the donor advised fund, as long as you show some giving on a regular basis, you don't want it to sit in there forever, but you can spread that money out and give it over the course of a long period of time. So we have executives that we work with that on retirement stuck a big chunk of highly appreciated stock into a donor advised fund and have been using that in retirement to fund their charitable goals and have had a huge impact on the charities without taking money out of their pocket to fund it. So once you're on a fixed income in retirement and you don't want to use your cash flow, you've built up this donor advised fund in order to be able to give the gifts. There are some limitations. You can finesse, generally speaking, but there are some limitations, so you want to ask the right questions around using them, but they are very easy to use, easy to set up at, for example, a Cleveland Foundation or an Akron Community Foundation, Charles Schwab, Fidelity. You can name the fund after your family. You can create a succession plan on the fund so that you can involve your children and your grandchildren in giving both now and in the future. So they've been a tool that clients have really enjoyed and leveraged pretty significantly. Down at the bottom here, also, CRATs, CLATs, and family foundations. We do have plenty of those. More on the complex side, more administrative work if you are interested, but you do have more control. So there are many, many reasons to set up family foundations and use those for your giving, or use CRATs and CLATs as well. And so that's it, y'all. We have come to the end. Our goal today was to give you some ideas on how to maximize your wealth at every stage, your wealth, your family's wealth, kids' wealth, grandkids' wealth. So we hope that you have at least a few tidbits to take away with you. If you have questions and you want to shout them out, you're welcome to. If you want to stop by and chat with any of us, any of the Fairport advisors in the room, please do. And again, we thank you for giving us your evening, and we're happy to see you here.